Good afternoon there, everybody. Thank you for joining us again on another one of our Safer at Home series talks. Glad you could join us today, and I'm glad that our speaker, Dr. Hermann, is far wiser than me because, as she pointed out to me, Mark, you realize I'm coming to you from Wales, and doing it at 7 at night would leave me in the wee hours of the morning. So she quickly corrected me and said, so we're going to do this at noon. And I told her she's a little bit of a lab rat because we don't normally do these things at noon. So I really appreciate the fact that you're here and that she's here. So it's a less ungodly hour for her and a little bit different time for us. So thank you for doing this. Thank you for joining us. As you know, all our talks are brought to us by the sponsorship of Cape Cod 5 for Citizens Federal Credit Union and Martha's Vineyard Savings, and all books that we offer are available at Eight Cousins Bookseller in Falmouth. Our guest today is Dr. Rachel Hermann, who specializes in colonial, revolutionary, and Atlantic history. And as she was telling me before, she's a New York girl who went to the University of Texas to do her PhD, and she's now studying and she's now teaching at the Cardiff University in Wales. So she, like us, is trying to navigate her way through COVID-19, but I greatly appreciate her taking the time. Would you welcome Dr. Rachel Hermann?
That's great. So thanks very much to Mark Schmidt, the Falmouth Historical Society and Museums on the Green for inviting me to give this talk today. And for moving the talk to lunchtime over there. I thought that since it's lunchtime, I might tell you about one of the ways that this book about hunger started. So not with Massachusetts, but with Connecticut. And just trying to get my PowerPoint slide to advance. There we go. So some of you will likely be familiar with Connecticut private Joseph Plum Martin, who served several times in the War for Independence and left a retrospective account of the war in 1830. Joseph Plum Martin had a really unfortunate habit of eating things that made him ill. And in one of my favorite passages, he obtains an ox's liver from camp butchers. He chucks it into his kettle. He ignores the fact that the longer he's boiled it, the harder it's become, and he eats the whole thing. And the next morning, as you might guess, he wakes up feeling really terrible. He goes to the camp butchers, who give him a dose of tartar emetic. He sits down upon a log, and in his own words, he discharges the hard junks of liver like grape shot from a field piece. So this is the part of the talk where I apologize if you're eating lunch. And I say that seriously. But what I wanted to do with this anecdote is to draw attention to one of the things that I was trying to do in the book, which was to emphasize that when we talk about food and when we talk about hunger, we need to talk about the gross and violent stuff along with the good stuff. So I don't know about you, but I love food TV. I watch the Great British Bake Off, or the Great British Baking Show, as you would call it. I watch Top Chef. I watch Chef's Table. And I think to a large extent, we're used to thinking about all of these different instances of food and culture where food makes us feel good. What I love about Joseph Plum Martin is that his account is replete with other commentary about struggles to find edible goods, what he ate, how frequently he found food, and his battles with what he dubbed the monster hunger as he and his fellow soldiers wandered through the countryside foraging for food while awaiting military action. So we're familiar with this idea that an army marches on its stomach. This is one that's familiar to enthusiasts of history as well as academic and popular historians. The question that really prompted the subsequent research for No Useless Mouth is what Martin and others meant by monstrous hunger. And I began to wonder what hunger meant in the 18th century. I personally today think of a very modern idea called hangriness, this sense of being hungry and angry at the same time. When I am not fed at regular intervals, I get hangry. But I started to wonder whether that was a familiar emotion and feeling in the 18th century. So I had a sort of set of questions that I tried to answer doing the research for the book. I wanted to know what people ate on a normal day in a year of unremarkable weather. I wanted to know what their strategies were for preventing famine in the short and the long term. I wanted to know how they reacted during periods of crop failure. Who was responsible for describing hunger and how they did so? And perhaps most importantly, I wondered whether going hungry could be a way to claim power. So the answer that my book provides is that before the Revolutionary War, there were many different ways of enduring, creating, and fighting hunger. No Useless Mouth shows that it was the war itself which gave British and then later American officials the knowledge to learn to claim that only they could stop hunger. So British and American officials learned to claim that they could prevent hunger by misusing history. And the misuse of history is an interesting concept, and we need to talk about what it looked like at the time. So I want to start with a contemporary example of the misuse of history to talk about hunger from a speech that the US Indian agent Timothy Pickering delivered to the Seneca named corn planter at a meeting in 1791. Pickering was a Salem, Massachusetts man. He had served in the Massachusetts militia during the war, and then afterwards would hold the position of Secretary of State as well as Secretary of War. But it was his success as a land speculator that prompted George Washington to appoint him as an Indian commissioner to the Iroquois, known today as the Haudenosaunee, known at the time variously as the Iroquois, sometimes as the Six Nations as depicted on this map from the 1770s, sometimes as the Five Nations. So the Iroquois were comprised of the Mohawks, Oneidas, Onondagas, Cayugas, Senecas, and Tuscaroras, and you'll note that you cannot see Mohawks and Tuscaroras on this map. Corn planter or John Abele had allied with the British in the recent War for Independence, as had most Mohawk, Onondaga, and Cayuga members of the Iroquois, which they did primarily because they saw the British as the likeliest to protect their land interests. Most Oneidas sided with the Americans for reasons that I'll get into in a bit, and the Tuscaroras split allegiances and supported both sides. At this 1791 meeting between Pickering and corn planter, Pickering made this speech that you should be able to see on this screen. So Pickering talks about white colonists coming to the island of North America, encountering Native Americans who mostly hunted and fished, whereas industrious colonists immediately became farmers who raised domesticated animals. There were two ways that Pickering was misusing history here. So he was misrepresenting the history of English colonists who depended on Wampanoags in Plymouth and Powhatans in Virginia for gifts of venison and corn for their very survival during their first several years in those respective colonies. So first, colonists did not immediately become farmers. The second way that Pickering misused history was to downplay the extensive Native American efforts in the past to prevent their own hunger. So historians know from work by ethnobotanists like Jane Mount Pleasant, who has recreated Iroquois cropping practices from the colonial period, that Iroquois crop production methods produced more abundant crops and were better at preventing soil erosion. And this was the case well into the 19th century. So we also know how extensive Native American crop production was by the 18th century. Because the American Revolution provides us with a history of American soldiers torching Native American cornfields. In this letter from future President George Washington to John Sullivan, George Washington provides Sullivan with instructions for the destruction of Iroquois villages during the 1779 American incursion into Iroquois from Pennsylvania to New York, during which Patriot soldiers wrote letters and diaries describing how they burned at least 160,000 bushels of Haudenosaunee corn, and they created a refugee crisis. So they sent Native Americans running to the forts of their British allies. And I think the American tactical thinking here was they wanted to create this refugee crisis as a way of refocusing British attention on supplying their allies, which would weaken them militarily against the Americans. But the Sullivan campaign was a campaign that targeted civilians, and the targeting of civilians would have been quite unusual if this was war between two European nations. It would have been seen as unacceptable and unusual to do this. But by this point in the 18th century, and well before, colonists had been arguing that it was acceptable to attack and kill Native American women and children. In No Useless Mouth, I wanted to give readers a way to talk about 18th century behaviors related to the endurance, creation, and prevention of hunger. So the first idea of victual warfare should already sound familiar to you because the Sullivan campaign was a campaign of victual warfare. It involved the burning of crops, the killing, maiming, and stealing of animals, and later the deployment of threats of starvation. I'm going to come back to the idea of victual imperialism at the bottom when I return to Timothy Pickering's misuse of history. But for the next couple of minutes here, I want to talk about food diplomacy for a little bit. So during the Revolutionary War, food diplomacy came to mean the sharing of or abstention from provisions, including grain, meat, and alcohol as a way of forging or maintaining alliances. In the book, I look at how food diplomacy worked during the Revolution, but in order to understand how it changed during the Revolution, I also look at how food diplomacy worked during the colonial period and thereafter. So during the colonial period, there wasn't this idea of a shared experience of hunger. Food diplomacy fit into other forms of diplomacy at the time. During the colonial period, British officials undertook what Eric Hinderaker has called negotiations of convenience with key tribes like the Iroquois, Creeks, and Cherokees. British officials hoped to find chiefs and sachems who would declare themselves subjects of the British monarch, while at the same time checking the power of other tributary Native American tribes in ways that advanced colonial land interests. In reality, most Native Americans would refuse to declare themselves British subjects, and the balance of power before the American Revolution largely favored Native American polities. What emerged diplomatically then was a type of diplomacy called forest diplomacy that forced British officials to learn Native American customs and practices. So key figures like Sir William Johnson, who was superintendent of Indian Affairs in North America, had to learn all of these different types of forest diplomacy. He learned the forms and practices of welcoming ceremonies and condolence speeches, which were used to limit violence during retributive feuds and cycles of war. He learned to use wampum. So you can see Johnson on the left and a wampum belt on the right. Wampum had a couple different meanings. It was at its root a seashell that over time sort of changed from being distributed symbolically to being used as a form of currency, that at the same time was also a key feature at treaties between natives and non-natives. So people would string wampum dyed different colors together into strings or belts that were distributed at treaties. It's usual, if you're looking at treaty documents, to see the phrase "a string" after a sort of single point of a speech, and belts were presented for major significant points. And we think that wampum could also function as a mnemonic device, so that people who had received wampum at previous treaties would bring those belts to subsequent treaties as a way of remembering what had been said and what had been agreed. So Sir William Johnson had to learn how to use wampum at treaties while delivering important messages and speeches imbued with different metaphors. He learned to host Indian councils at his home, Johnson Hall, depicted retrospectively in the middle of the slide there. And he learned to fix the price of trade goods at the request of Iroquois orators. So during this period, food diplomacy really fit into the practice of food diplomacy. It wasn't special, it wasn't different, it wasn't more important than other types of diplomacy. Before the war and within this colonial context, it was very common for Native Americans to describe themselves as starving when they were not, because the rhetorical claim to be starving, to be hungry, allowed hosts like Johnson to dispense goods, gifts, and provisions without seeming too proud. Before the war, British officials provided grain and rum to Native Americans on their way to and from council and treaty meetings, and they dispensed gifts of rations to significant Native leaders. Iroquois women controlled the majority of food supplies in Indian country, and their permission was necessary for warriors to go to war because they controlled campaign provisions. Now, Native women were also the ones responsible for agriculture. So if we look forward to events like the Sullivan Campaign, it's useful to think about how military violence destroyed the labor of Native women specifically. Before the war, in the main, Native Americans supplied themselves. As late as 1765, deputy agents like George Prohan reported that Native Americans had not come to British forts over the winter, either because they had supplied themselves or because they had gone to stay with kin groups who supplied them. And this was the pattern for at least a century preceding the conflict. Now, this really changed during the Revolution, as I argue in the book. And a number of things happened to change food diplomacy. So it became more difficult to disperse trade goods and gifts that had secured alliances in the past because of blockades and clogged supply lines. Food, at the same time, became more important as a way to secure alliances, while at the same time becoming more challenging to supply. So it became more challenging to supply it, but it remained easier to supply food than it did to supply trade goods and gifts. When it became hard to supply, it became hard to supply because it took British military planners a while to figure out how many provisions to ship, where to ship them from, how to prevent their ships full of supplies from sinking, and how to preserve what made it long enough to keep it from rotting. And they struggled so much because the last war that they had fought in North America, they had fought with American colonists as their allies against the French in the 7 Years' War. So their context was being used to be able to depend on the countryside, which they could not do during the War for Independence. So in one of my favorite examples from the book, there's an example of a flour that has come from the North American colonies. My guess is probably from Philadelphia or Baltimore. Major supply areas shifted a bit, but mainly came from the mid-Atlantic future states. And this American flour had been shipped to England. It had sat on a wharf for a while. It had gotten wet and rained on, and then someone had loaded it back onto a British ship and sent it back across the ocean for the supply of British soldiers. So it's really not surprising during this period to see bread described as moldy or shipped in bags short of weight, which is what you'll find if you're looking for descriptions of bread that's coming through Cork, Ireland. So British allies of the Iroquois began struggling to supply indigenous warriors, even with symbolic gifts of provisions. And at the same time that this was happening, the Iroquois were challenging these power relationships because it turned out that they were quite capable of supplying their British allies with corn, squash, beans, game meat, and to a small extent, cattle that they were giving to non-native British soldiers. In the wake of the Sullivan campaign during this refugee crisis, this power that the Iroquois possessed allowed them to change food diplomacy to include the shared experience of going hungry together, or of distributing or abstaining from food as a way of strengthening alliances. So Six Nations allies began to deprive their British allies of food when there was not enough to go around, and my research uncovered instances of British allied Iroquois destroying the grain and meat secured during their joint campaigns with the British. The title of No Useless Mouth comes from a 1780 letter by Frederick Haldimand, governor of Quebec, in which he tried to command that no useless mouth could remain at British forts during the winter. Britain's Iroquois allies made this command ineffective by showing their efficacy at destroying provisions, as well as setting an example for their allies of their willingness to go hungry. These changes pushed British officials to try harder to be more accommodating. They spent time learning that their Iroquois allies preferred corn rations and baked wheat bread over flour when corn was not available. Pork was better than beef, and although preferences for salt versus fresh meat varied, what didn't was the Iroquois preference to say what type of provisions in meat they received in any given season. As a result of these changes, British spending on Iroquois alliances skyrocketed. And just as an example of one fort, at Fort Niagara, expenditures by the British increased from 500 pounds New York currency at the start of the war to 100,000 pounds in 1781. So the British were working quite hard to work to keep these alliances working well. As I sometimes like to remind my British students, however, Great Britain lost the war. Their loss was a disaster for Native Americans, the majority of whom had allied with the British or remained neutral, because Native Americans were not considered in the 1783 peace between Britain and the United States. As we see from these records, US Indian agents at various meetings with Native Americans in the early 1780s tried to claim that Native Americans had entered the war without provocation and that the US claims to Native American territory were valid through the right of conquest. So just to kind of describe some of the images you're seeing, up there on the top right is a screenshot from the Papers of the War Department, which is a great free online database that has scanned images of 18th and I think early 19th century leaders, often relating to Native American affairs. There's a crowdsourced transcription project, so you can get involved transcribing letters if you're interested. And then at the bottom right, I've given you a screenshot of the inside of the Historical Society of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia so that we can all just fantasize about a time when we might all be able to be back in the archives together. And to give you a sense of some of the documents that provide us with evidence of meetings between American officials and the Iroquois, and then at the bottom with Chippewas, Delawares, Ottawas, and Wyandotte. So the US tried to claim that Native Americans had entered the war without provocation, which was not true. They had entered the war because they wanted to protect their land interests, and they tried to enforce this claims of conquest. Ultimately, the US government was not able to enforce these claims because this was the period of the Articles of Confederation and central government was not particularly strong or effective. This changed a little bit in 1789 after the ratification of the Constitution. Before this point, the government could not raise taxes to go to war against Native Americans, and even after ratification, centralized government took a while to become effective. So when Jefferson arrived in New York to take over the State Department, he had 2 chief clerks, 2 assistants, and 1 part-time translator working for him. And if you want to compare this with the diplomacy of the British with Native Americans in the colonial period, any given meeting usually lasted 2 to 3 months, during which time there were several translators who were required to be present because even the different members of the Iroquois tribes didn't all speak the same language. So by contrast, what the Americans were capable of doing diplomacy-wise wasn't that great. This was still a case of a weak United States trying to gain leverage with more experienced diplomats than they were. Which brings us back to Timothy Pickering. So during the late 1780s and early 1790s, Timothy Pickering joined other men like the renowned Dr. Benjamin Rush and the Reverend Samuel Kirkland in researching Native American attitudes toward hunger and trying to learn what their British predecessors had already. So as you can see, these queries dealt with how Native Americans prevented hunger, how they dealt with it on military campaigns, and yes, whether their execratory habits were more impressive than their non-Native counterparts, which should remind us of Joseph Plum Martin and some of the reasons that this project was interesting to me to begin with. Now, during the 1780s and 1790s, US Indian commissioners switched from this claim about conquest to trying to copy generous British diplomacy. And I think they did this for two reasons. Now, I've talked mostly about the Haudenosaunee and the Northern Theater of War here. In the South, when we're talking about Creeks and Cherokees, a state of middle warfare prevailed. And I can kind of go into why I think that was the case during the Q&A. But what this meant is that by the time the United States had become a nation, there was an association among many key leaders between hungry Indians and violence. The US had to practice generous diplomacy both because the government was weak and because it was worried about the violent effects of not doing so. US officials like Timothy Pickering held treaties, they distributed alcohol, they hosted feasts, and they distributed food aid during times of crop failure, which were prevalent in the late 1780s and early 1790s, particularly all up and down the eastern seaboard. In large part, Iroquois leaders were the ones who taught Pickering how to be an effective Native American diplomat, and he was a slow learner. So in this great moment in 1791, when Pickering is supposed to meet a party of Senecas on the Tioga River, Pickering receives a message from Seneca runners informing Pickering that he's expected to do what's called hanging kettles and providing a walking staff. To hang kettles was a metaphor for sending quantities of grain to people on their way to a treaty, and the walking staff were kegs of rum. And the expectation was that you would provide these to Native Americans coming to treaties, as well as at treaties, as well as on their way home. Pickering didn't really want to listen. So he sent small quantities of these items while also sending a message telling the people who were coming that there wasn't going to be a lot for them to eat once they arrived. And once they did, an Oneida named Good Peter, also one of the members of the Iroquois, the Oneidas, Good Peter criticized Pickering. He said that he supposed that the business of hosting treaties was novel to Pickering. And Pickering was so embarrassed that he agreed to reimburse Good Peter for the provisions that they had had to buy on their way. It was also after this awkward interaction that Pickering delivered his false history of early America. So let me bring us back to what Pickering said again, and to talk about how Pickering was describing hunger in history. I want to talk about what was going on here, what Pickering hoped to achieve, and how Cornplanter responded on behalf of other Iroquois. In the book, I say that Pickering recounted this narrative because he was trying to help the United States implement a food policy of victual imperialism. That is, he was trying to change Native American food production methods and thus their abilities to prevent hunger, to facilitate the transfer of land from natives to non-natives. Historians have described this policy previously using the name which its creators used, the Plan of Civilization, and I'll get into why that's not the best term in a little bit here. But the idea behind the plan was that as the federal government grew stronger, US officials tried to decrease the cost of food diplomacy by claiming that they were searching for ways for Native Americans to prevent their own hunger. So this is an image that was originally titled Benjamin Hawkins Among the Creek Indians, and it's been retitled The Plan of Civilization. The plan relied upon the idea that Native Americans needed to adopt American notions of proper husbandry, which Americans defined as plow agriculture and dairy and meat production done by men, while women spun, wove, and raised children. The argument that US officials made was that civilized Indians could become usefully independent and to use less land to do so. So what we see in this image is really an embodiment of the plan. This is Benjamin Hawkins in the foreground with two Creek men whom he is teaching to use a plow. There is a Creek woman raising a child on the left in the foreground, and on the right we see the metaphorical bounty of this plan in the form of corn, turnips, maybe potatoes, and if you see in the background behind him on the right, there are some blurry cattle in the background as well. So at the same time that agents like Benjamin Hawkins, Timothy Pickering, and Samuel Kirkland were learning food diplomacy, they were also writing down their ideas related to the plan of civilization, which involved creating schools, model farms, and revising gender roles for Native American women, as well as speaking to Iroquois and Creek leaders in an attempt to persuade them to their line of thinking. This was a plan of imperialism because it sought to change Native American hunger prevention practices while taking native land. Samuel Kirkland, pictured here on the left, with Timothy Pickering now on the right. Samuel Kirkland was a white Christian missionary who had lived with and preached to Iroquois and Stockbridge Indians in various villages since the 1760s. Some of this might be familiar to those of you who have learned about Stockbridge Native Americans, who were Mohicans from the Upper East Hudson area who had migrated into Massachusetts in Stockbridge and nearby before the Revolution. Samuel Kirkland had led conversion efforts to Christianity among Stockbridges and Oneidas that explain why many members of these tribes sided with the Americans. Now, it's ironic that Kirkland had so many ideas for improving Native Americans' abilities to feed themselves, because while he lived with them, he was not capable of doing so himself. So up at the top here, we see a speech that Kirkland made to the Seneca leader named Big Tree, where Kirkland talks about the wandering nature of the Iroquois and the benefits of the civilization plan. But at the bottom, and in the middle, we have his admissions that when he was among them, he was surviving on strawberries and fish. He also talks about how the Oneidas supplied him with provisions, and he talks about how embarrassed he is that he cannot provide for himself because of the lack of improvements in his own husbandry and cultivation. Despite his failings at provisioning himself, however, Kirkland had enough authority to push the Iroquois to change. He passed messages between and translated for the Iroquois and the US government, and he funded his school for Iroquois children from the donations of land speculators. So, there were several problems to the plan of civilization. First is the fact that US officials fundamentally misunderstood Native American appetites, and they remained very uncertain about the extent to which Native Americans actually required food aid. They often heard rhetorical claims about starvation, common as you'll recall from the colonial period, and assumed that Native Americans really were starving when they were not. The other big problem is that Native Americans already grew crops. Americans' destructions of corn bushels during the Revolutionary War, which happened during the Sullivan Campaign, but also happened during 1776 incursions among the Cherokee. Despite the fact that the US was claiming that Native Americans needed to learn how to farm, they had a long history of destroying the produce of Native American farming during the Revolution and then during the Western Confederacy or Northwest Indian War that gathered speed during the 1780s and ended in 1795 with the Battle of Fallen Timbers. So although it was difficult for US officials to accept Native agricultural methods, it was equally difficult to convince Native Americans to farm when they already did so. Native responses to the so-called plan of civilization were skeptical, to put it mildly. So this is a response from Cornplanter in a speech sent to George Washington. And what he's doing here is he is invoking an Iroquois oral history to remember the Sullivan Campaign, during which George Washington earned the name Town Destroyer. He is talking about the lack of trust, and he's critiquing the hypocrisy of the United States taking land before the so-called civilization process is finished. He wonders at the bottom whether the United States plans to leave the Iroquois any land to till. And what I particularly like about this letter is that we probably know that Timothy Pickering read it, because it was enclosed in a message from Henry Knox to Timothy Pickering before he delivered his false history to Cornplanter later. So this sort of it expresses the extent of Haudenosaunee skepticism of the plan. It underscores the US tendency to take land, and we know they took land. We know that the United States took land quite aggressively from 1776 onwards. So these exchanges suggest to us just how fraught histories of hunger were and how contested they became. So there's a lot of the book that I haven't talked about in this talk today. I figured I would keep it a little bit shorter so that we could have a discussion about it. I haven't talked about the more extensive victual warfare that prevailed in Creek and Cherokee country. I haven't talked about formerly enslaved victual warriors who became victual warriors as a result of British Governor Virginia Lord Dunmore's proclamation in November 1775, which granted freedom to slaves of rebel masters. This resulted in a rise of Black victual warriors who descended on plantations of former masters to steal food for the support of British troops, before eventually fleeing to Nova Scotia and Sierra Leone, where they briefly created their own hunger-preventing food laws. So obviously, if you want to read more, you can buy my book. I think it's important to support your local bookstore, and I hope you'll do that. But I did also want to put the Cornell Open logo up on this last slide to point out that my book is open access, which means that if you go to the Cornell Open website, you should be able to download and read a copy of the book for free on your iPad, Kindle, or e-reader of your choice. What I want to circle back to in order to sum things up is the idea of hunger and useless mouths. My overall argument is that Native Americans and formerly enslaved people were not useless mouths. In the 18th century, people expected to endure hunger, but we shouldn't assume that people who did so were powerless. Hunger endurance could be a way to strengthen alliances and assert authority. It could serve similar purposes when hunger was created. By the end of the 18th century, hunger prevention gave the United States an advantage. So Native Americans lost the fight against hunger not because they became bad at preventing it, but because white officials circumscribed their abilities to prevent it themselves through the misuse of history. We need to remind ourselves that at the point of the nation's founding, hunger prevention was not neutral. Timothy Pickering, by claiming he possessed the knowledge to best prevent hunger, legitimized a campaign of land grabs by the US government. It was only by seizing control of the historical narrative and attempting to control depictions of hunger in history that federal officials succeeded in beginning their long campaign of dispossession.
Thank you, Dr. Herman. I happen to find food history fascinating. I'm glad you talked about this. One of the things that it struck me as you're talking about this is we've all kind of grown up learning about Valley Forge, you know, the great hunger pangs that the Continental Army was undergoing, and frankly, the old saw about an army marches on its stomach. Well, this is something that it sounds like in a way Pickering and the colonial forces, the American forces, kind of weaponized food. So it kind of is it fair to say it kind of turns that narrative on its head a bit?
That was my hope. I think we're used to this idea of an army marching on its stomach, but I think that saying kind of minimizes how frequently soldiers went without food and did their duty anyway, and it minimizes the different ways that hunger was something that people embraced in the 18th century because there weren't these systems of support to keep it from being as much of a regular problem.
Okay, a reminder, if you got a question, use the chat feature down below. Was it Pickering's objective to ultimately force the natives to go west and seek their own food? Did he ever flat out say what his ultimate goal was, or was this just trying to be an immediate, this is a way to win the war tactic?
I think what they said was that they wanted to implement the plan so that Native Americans would require less land to hunt. So that was that was what they put in their letters. At the same time, people like Henry Knox, who was Secretary of War and who corresponded the most with Pickering, was pretty clear that he knew that Native Americans had complained about all the ways that the United States had encroached on their land and that land issues were a continuing source of discontentment. So I don't think it surprised US officials when their tendency to take land early in this introduction period of the plan of civilization, I don't think it surprised them that those seizures created conflict.
You touched on something that's also in your book about the freed Black former slaves and going to Nova Scotia. Can you, I don't know, weaponize but how were they able to use food as a cudgel for their own support and assistance?
Mm-hmm. So the short answer is they don't do that as powerfully or as effectively as their Native American counterparts. During the war, formerly enslaved Black people are very good at destroying provisions or stealing them for the British, but they're not very good at supplying themselves. And they're not very good at supplying themselves because if they're captured, they risk enslavement. So they have to be more careful than Native Americans who have more freedom to go where they want. What happens in Nova Scotia is that it is a very disorganized migration. Formerly enslaved people migrate with white loyalists who also go to Halifax. They arrive in what's now Canada in some towns that are so newly plotted out that they don't have names, they're only numbered. So it's really scattershot. And there's this very brief period of time where formerly enslaved people are really able to corner the market in fishing and the provisions trade. But then what happens is that white loyalists implement a bunch of food laws that make it more difficult for Black colonists to do what they have been doing. What I find interesting and what I talk about in the book is that once they get to Sierra Leone, which they manage to get to because the British are in the process of trying to create an anti-slavery colony that will serve as an example of what can happen if you lean into abolition. What's interesting is that once they get to Sierra Leone, Black colonists re-implement the food laws that have created problems for them in Nova Scotia. And they use them as a way to claim more political power and more rights. And this works for about a decade before those laws create too much tension with the local African population, the Temne and the Susu. And at that point, the white Sierra Leone Council decides that all of the food laws that Black loyalists have been passing should no longer be legitimate. That sort of happens there.
I could tell from when we were talking about it, is it fair to say that Timothy Pickering was not a favorite of yours? You didn't seem overly fond of him.
Well, that's always the question for historians, isn't it? Jill Lepore has a wonderful essay called Historians Who Love Too Much. That's about what happens when historians get too close to their subjects. I don't feel fondly toward Timothy Pickering, but I feel fondly about the Timothy Pickering papers, which are at the Massachusetts Historical Society and are wonderful because they're on microfilm. So you can really get a really nice sense of what was going on in Indian affairs in the 1790s. And it's a good way to find filtered evidence of Indigenous voices in the historical record. So I like Pickering for that. And I like Pickering as well because he made me think more about history and how we practice it. And I think as a result of writing this book, I am more uncomfortable as a historian than I was when I started, because learning about Pickering kind of introduced me to all these ways that he misused it. And I think I don't have an answer for how to deal with that. But I think it's really interesting to think about. And so I'm grateful to him as a character for making me think about that.
How long did it take you to research this? That was a very thoughtful answer, by the way. How long did it take you to research this?
Well, let's see. This started out as a PhD dissertation. Well, no, that's not really true. I started writing about food as an undergraduate. I was at swim practice and I had to write an annotated or a research proposal for an annotated bibliography in a class on the American Revolution. And I was at swim practice and we were doing a kick set so we could talk because we were leaning on kickboards. And I was panicking. I didn't know what I was going to write about. And one of my friends said to me, "You should write about food. You talk about it all the time. You've just, spent the last 5 minutes wondering what we're going to have for dinner in the dining hall." So I wrote about food in a paper as an undergraduate, and I wrote an undergraduate dissertation about food and American culinary nationalism. And that's when I went to grad school to thinking I wanted to write about. And then I realized I didn't know very much about the colonial period. And in doing that research, I became interested in the absence of food and cannibalism, which is more connected to hunger and the absence of food than we might think. And so I started grad school in 2007 and spend a couple years reading, and then I spent a year traveling around the US to different archives. So I literally drove my car from Texas to Colonial Williamsburg, and then all throughout North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia, going to those state archives. Drove back to Texas, drove to the Huntington out in California, took some trips to London, and started a permanent job in 2013 where I sort of had a manuscript that I revised, thanks to generous readers and my editor, Michael McGandy at Cornell University Press. So it took a while.
Okay. I knew I just couldn't keep up with you on a travel log. So what do you have any projects in the pipeline next, or what's on the horizon for you after this?
So I'm still interested in food and hunger. I'm interested now in the relationship between hunger prevention programs and the drawing of borders. So I'm interested in regions where the United States, England, and Spain fought for control, which they did along the Gulf Coast, and sort of in Georgia, still a little bit in Sierra Leone. And I'm interested in, the book is very, it's very Anglo. It's based in English language sources, and so I wanted to work on my Spanish and see whether the story of Spanish diplomatic records changes the history of hunger and the drawing of borders among Creeks and Cherokees in the South. And that's sort of what I'm interested in now.
I've got a question here. Was there a tendency to provide more rum to the Native Americans as a way to control them as part of providing provisions?
That's a great question. By the time the United States, so I think that was probably the case during the colonial period, and Native Americans complained a lot to British officials that unscrupulous traders often plied them with too much rum as a way to encourage overly generous land cessions. And so some of the requests to Johnson's about regulating trade were requests to control the distribution of rum. By the time the United States takes over, there is a practice of curtailing rum disbursements, so that there's usually a practice of providing a welcoming drink at the start of a multi-week or multi-month treaty, and then rum is usually reserved until after the treaty has been concluded, when large quantities are then dispersed. And the hope is that on the part of the Americans is that this will kind of cut down on the number of complaints by Native Americans saying that the treaties aren't valid because they were made when people were inebriated. This is only somewhat effective because the US also at the same time has a tendency to hold treaties with people who aren't recognized as authoritative enough to cede land. So the treaties are deemed invalid by Native Americans because they're not conducted for other proper reasons. But the curtailment of rum is certainly in force by the 1790s. Benjamin Hawkins is one of the key proponents of this change.
And lastly, before you go, I got to ask you, how do you like teaching in Wales?
It's good. I like it. I like the students, and part of what's been great about the last 5 or 10 years is the number of online databases that make it easy for students to do research into the American Revolution and Native American history online. So I like to say to my students how great it is that they can do research in their pajamas. So that's great.
Well, thank you for doing this today, and thank you for being so cognizant of the time, because again, you caught that, not me. So so I'm glad that it was able to work out for your time, for our time. Thank you for taking the time for doing this. This was fascinating, and good luck with this book. Good luck navigating COVID, and thanks again. Congratulations on the book, and thank you for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you, everybody.